A smooth sea will never create a skilled sailor. The process of uncovering new ideas and discovering new tools and techniques, or even finding new people to collaborate with, requires that we put ourselves in places of unfamiliarity. Visionaries and trendsetters know how to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, which is where we can build the skills that make us better in stormy situations. And I think that's medicine we all need a dose of from time to time. Changes in the storytelling technological landscape should never be something we fear. Pushing boundaries is how we learn. And those lessons aren't just for the end user. It's critical to provide feedback so the product people behind technology are able to make informed decisions on what they need to make it better. I'm really curious about how AI can improve the quality of video images, maybe even make them more cinematic. I've recently been doing some experiments with AI to explore this. I started in episode 9 with enhancing poor quality video, then moved to episode 10 with examining optical properties from a top-of-the-line cinema camera. This experiment set a benchmark in which we can evaluate how analog characteristics of lenses produce distinct, highly cinematic looks. Then in episode 11, we took the brand new iPhone 15 and tried to push its latest spatial analytics using cinema mode. But because the sensor size of an iPhone is so much smaller than a large format sensor like a red Monstro, the optical magnification factor of iPhone falls a little short. Even though the iPhone has best-in-class focal length options for a smartphone, the tiny sensor size means images will have deep depth of field, so everything appears to be in focus. That's why we tried a side-by-side using Apple's latest updates to cinema mode, which simulate depth of field by using spatial data to blur background and foreground objects that synthetically give the impression of depth. Now, when we published this experiment, 250,000 people viewed it. Many people instantly saw the value of a phone producing images a bit more like a cinema system. Even though there are clear problems with these images, a cinema solution as available as a smartphone offset its technological ceiling. But others didn't celebrate it at all. Some zeroed in on the limits of the tech, concentrating on where it failed, and were off-put by the fact that it wasn't real. So you should watch episodes 9 and 10 and 11 so you can see where you feel this tech shines and where it fails. But then something unexpected happened. Right when I was doing these episodes, Apple disclosed that their most recent keynote event was shot entirely on iPhone 15. So how'd they do that? And more importantly, why? Well, they released a behind-the-scenes look at how they made it, which you might guess got a lot of people talking. To some, this move is just a typical Apple flex. But to me, it's a snapshot of the future. I think when Apple is willing to push its own tech to the limits, they're giving us hints as to where they're headed. And I think I know where. But before I get to that, I want to see for myself if it was even realistic to push an iPhone as far as Apple did, or perhaps even further. I always love the intersection between professional tools and democratized tools because I believe they both have their place. But for a phone to really perform like a cinema camera, it's not just about the look. It needs to work the way crews work. So what can we do to build a tech stack around iPhone that makes it look and feel like a true cinema camera? First, we need a better app to capture with. That's where Blackmagic comes in with the camera app they launched last September. Here we have total control over lenses, frames per second, shutter, ISO, white balance, and tint. Next, we need a high-quality record format. Apple recently added ProRes to iPhone, which is available as a record format using the Blackmagic camera app in 4K 10-bit sampling. But ProRes 4K files are really big, so we need a way to record them. That's solved with the new USB-C port, which supports bus-powered external drives. Next, we need more dynamic range out of the sensor. Apple released Apple Log, which we can choose to record with, but while Log helps dynamic range, it's unpleasant to monitor. Thankfully, the Blackmagic camera app supports custom LUTs, so I asked my friend colorist Ian Verdevec at Light Iron to create a custom LUT based on Apple Log as the input. Next, we need proper monitoring. With a USB-C adapter, we can connect an HDMI port. Then I convert that to SDI so I can do a proper output to an onboard SDI monitor. I'm using the Small HD 702 and loop that through to a Teradek Bolt 3000 XT for a wireless signal to Video Village. Blackmagic supports several external monitor configurations, including cleaned or framed overlay, which is ideal. And lastly, we need control over focus. The Blackmagic camera app supports external devices, and we can use a tilde nucleus to control the focus over Bluetooth. Now, one thing the iPhone doesn't have is iris control. Most smartphones use shutter speed to control exposure. That's where B-Script comes in with their Beast Cage, which gives us quarter 20 mounts that allow us not only to protect the camera, but to put it on a riser so that it can be configured with a proper map box. To operate all this smoothly, we need a good tripod head. So I'm using an O'Connor 2575 with an airy dovetail base plate. I used some old 19mm brackets from my Red 1 camera to mount the accessories. I set up the matte box, riser, and cage as the base. All of this gets wired to an Anton Bauer Gold mount, which has a D-tap and USB-A port. So I'm able to power this entire thing off a single 90-watt-hour battery for hours. A little cable management, and well, like I said, it looks a little weird, but what you're seeing here is a camera rig that shoots ProRes 4K in log, and it can live on a Mitchell mount for sticks and sliders. Now, I realize marrying these accessories together on an iPhone seems odd, and to some of you probably pointless, but this could be an early snapshot of the next era of videography. If you don't think of it as a phone, what you're really seeing is a 4K CMOS sensor that captures 10-bit ProRes log into an SSD with wireless leaded video. That's not terribly different from what most cameras shoot with today. Most importantly, this configuration is familiar to professional cinematography. Then I asked cinematographer Shannon Stutenroth if she'd be willing to shoot a short film testing out a professional configuration of iPhone. Our goal was to just treat it like a cinema camera the whole time.
My strategy to start out lighting for the day is to start with the iPhone, look through the iPhone screen for everything with the Blackmagic app. Then we switched over to the cinema cameras. There's times where I'm looking at the monitor and lighting and forgetting that I'm on the iPhone. It just feels like I'm looking through any cinema camera.
I feel pretty confident in saying this is the biggest leap in smartphone cinema to date. We were all impressed with the technology because unlike the last shoot using cinema mode, this time we just did our jobs exactly the same. But as much as this rig gets right in terms of interaction and operation, it doesn't quite get the look right. There's still that problem with depth of field. Since the sensor size of the phone is so small, too much depth of field robs the image of that final cinematic feel. And that got me wondering, what if we could use AI to map the 2D ProRes image into 3D space and then use that to simulate our own depth of field? So we decided to try that. I worked with VFX expert Jason Fodder, and we brainstormed some tools and techniques that could help us.
iPhone has cinematic mode, but it's kind of gimmicky, right?
Yes.
You're not going to shoot a movie on cinematic mode, but they also have enabled ProRes log.
Yeah.
You're going to shoot a movie on ProRes log. That's how movies are shot.
Yeah.
That depth plugin is the key.
It's the key.
And it's AI based.
Yeah. Alexander Court is the founder of Blace plugins, and he built a killer AI depth scanning tool. What this technology can do is analyze a 2D image and then convert it into dimensional layers, which are then identified through luminance. Images that are further away become darker, and images that are closer become brighter.
See how you barely see her?
Yeah.
But that's because she's in that really dark part of the frame, because that whole section of the image is in focus.
Yeah. So thanks to the AI analysis of Blace, ProRes files from the iPhone can create synthetic depth of field by mapping the luminance to a percentage of lens blur. So here's how the test goes. First, we shoot on the red Monstro sensor so we have a proper control of an image with real depth of field. This establishes our baseline. Let's add the color correction grade from colorist Nick Leroux. In this establishing shot, the red Monstro camera is focused on our talent, actress Angela Palermo, in the background. With a prime lens at a T1.8, we see very shallow depth of field in the foreground where the table is near the lens, creating a lot of dimensionality in the image. Now let's go to the iPhone 15 using the Blackmagic camera app. We start in log and closely match the framing and focus on Angela. Let's apply the LUT and then the grade. And even though we have virtually the same shot, there's more depth of field, which significantly limits the separation between foreground and background objects. Side by side, we can clearly see the difference in depth even when the focus follows our subject. Now let's run the iPhone through Blace and create a depth map. We can see here the same shot now visualized by luminance. Again, objects in the background are dark, objects in the foreground are white. The transitions between them represent the geometric distance in 3 dimensions, which allows us to apply a dimensional blur. So if we take the same shot as before and now map a lens blur to the luminance channel, we artificially replicate the same depth of field characteristics of a proper cinema sensor. Here again is the Monstro sensor, now the iPhone original, the depth map, and now the iPhone final. Because the source material on iPhone is 4K ProRes in 10-bit log, and we can control the focus with the tilted nucleus, we're able to get an impressive depth map and give a better sensation of real depth of field. Now let's look at this with a proper rack focus and a camera move. On the Monstro Cinema sensor, this shot starts with the focus in the middle of the frame. Then as Angela reacts to a suspicious noise, we begin to push in, which further shrinks the distance between the lens and our subject. Note the focus characteristics on Angela's face compared to the rear wall. Our camera assistant tracks Angela as she moves closer to frame and eventually exits. Then we quickly rack to the background and reveal our ghost, played by Sabina, who is about 15 feet away. Now let's try this on the iPhone. We start with the original. Even though our camera assistant is pulling focus, since this is a 24mm lens, Angela's face and the background are not on distinctly different focal planes. The map on the rear wall and Angela's face seem to be relatively similar in terms of sharpness. As the shot moves on and Angela tracks closer to the lens, we see a subtle focus change, but it's hard to notice until Angela leaves the frame entirely and we rack to Sabina in the background. Now let's take a look at the depth map where we see a clear distinction between focus point, white, and background, black. Because the focus follows Angela's face, she remains white. Now we apply that to the iPhone and add our blur. Let's wipe through the same shot where we see no lens blur, now lens blur. Again, no lens blur, lens blur. If we examine the final moment here, we can compare iPhone to the Red Cinema sensor, and using AI depth mapping, we've made a significant improvement in cinematic appeal. In fact, if we put the iPhone in cinema mode, we can actually compare Apple's in-camera spatial mapping to our post-AI depth mapping. Our post-processing, coupled with the improved control afforded by the Blackmagic camera app, has cleaner lines and more realistic blur and bokeh properties. As we look at the comparison on other setups, the point here isn't to replicate cinema cameras for the people who have them. It's to provide cinematic characteristics for the people who don't. That also doesn't mean one AI filter will automatically create cinematic images for you. Cinematographer Shannon Stutenroth, her gaffer Sean Singer, AC's Amritha Mary and Chuck Roke, and a great crew are critical in creating images that depth mapping can work with. What I'm most impressed with is how our rig and video village configuration allowed us to just work normally. With the right talent, the right equipment, and the right software, I think we can inch smartphones a little closer to the cinematic arena. If you want to be a filmmaker, shooting a movie on an iPhone should not be your end goal. But if a smartphone is all you have access to, then it's the ideal place to start. The best parts of democratization help people who don't have the same resources as everyone else, which is why of all the things to criticize here, accessibility shouldn't be one of them. Which leads us back to what is Apple doing with all these features in the iPhone? Actually, the real question is why? Why put ProRes in an iPhone at all? No one uses it. Why put log encoding or external monitoring in a phone? Nobody asked for that. And wireless follow focus? Well, 16 years ago, when iPhone came out, Apple annihilated the point and shoot market with their camera phones. Apple's brand is now associated with photography as much as Canon or Nikon or Kodak. Google Pixel and Samsung Galaxy followed not far behind. In response to this threat, the mirrorless DSLR market made massive improvements to video modes in all their still cameras. And I think Apple Pro Video has a new target, and the professional features within iPhone 15 are a testing ground for a new product that could serve the mid-market with the images we just created, only purpose-built with Apple Silicon and a proper lens mount. But who knows if that's the plan. When I was in college, we used to fight over Canon XL1s and Sony PD150s. Today, an iPhone 15 does more, costs less, and looks a whole lot better. So what would happen if we offered an AI depth of field model as part of Strada transcoding? There sure are a lot of smartphones out there.